Let's all imagine, if we will, a massive nuclear disaster on a global scale. What would happen to us all? Would we survive? What would the world be like once we're all gone? Well, let's talk about it. Right from the get-go, we'd see a massive loss of life, of course, and because we're imagining an apocalyptic level scenario here, we'll say over half the world's population gets killed off. Imagine the explosion of incredibly powerful bombs, each capable of destroying entire cities in an instant, unleashing intense heat and destructive shock waves that cause buildings to collapse, fires to spread rapidly, and everything in their vicinity to be completely obliterated. Anyone caught in or near the initial blast zones would likely die instantly or suffer severe injuries. Anyone further away may survive initially, but they'd be exposed to dangerous levels of radiation from the fallout. More on that in a bit though. A large percentage of people would die in the initial blasts, and in the days that would follow, more and more people would start dying off from injury. People lucky enough to survive all of that, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, would then have a whole smorgasbord of issues to deal with, which I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this list. Next, we'd have displacement, with survivors struggling to relocate to any safe areas that might remain. It would be complete and utter chaos, and any areas lucky enough to be unaffected from the nuclear blasts would be severely strained, not just with their own populations fighting over resources, but all the displaced survivors descending on these areas in search of safety. The healthcare system would be flooded, food and water shortages would be rampant, the economy would totally collapse, resources would be stretched so thin that people would start getting desperate. Violence and crime would rise abruptly, riots, looting, and the worst part, people would have nowhere to go. The land surrounding any safe zones would be contaminated and destroyed. So forget your idea, about driving out to some secluded cabin to get away from it all. It would likely get to the point where unaffected cities might just turn people away altogether, leaving people starving and stranded in the radioactive wasteland, where they'd have even more horrors to deal with. Imagine Chernobyl, but on a massive scale. Huge stretches of land would either be decimated from nuclear bombs or abandoned because of all the radioactivity. The areas hit by bombs would be left with fallout, a mix of radioactive particles that contaminate the air, the soil, the water. These particles emit harmful radiation, which can linger for years, even decades. The fallout zones become wastelands where life can barely exist. Plants are unable to grow in the toxic soil, and animals either die off or become mutated by the radiation. More on animals later, so stay tuned. Crossing these large stretches of wasteland would be treacherous. The radiation would seep into people's bodies, causing all kinds of issues. Even short exposure would have deadly consequences. If there was any semblance of a society left, and enough people, attempts could be made to clean up the areas, but it would be slow. The radiation would make it dangerous for workers to spend extended periods in the affected areas, and decontaminating the soil and water would take years, if not decades, and even then, there's still a good chance the land would never fully recover. The massive release of smoke, soot, and debris into the atmosphere could also trigger a nuclear winter, where temperatures would drop severely, leading to even more widespread death and destruction. Yay! Things would already be bad enough as is with the small amount of resources and contaminated land, so a severe drop in temperature would just exacerbate things. On top of all the negative effects, it would just be bleak. Normal winters can be pretty gray, but we still have some sunny days to, break up all the doom and gloom a bit. But with a nuclear winter, that would not be the case. That's because a nuclear winter is caused by all the nasty crap from explosions really just darkening the sky, blocking out the sun's warmth. It's similar to a volcanic winter where mass amounts of volcanic ash and sulfur aerosols are released into the stratosphere, essentially blocking out the sun. And aside from the darkness and the cold, growing seasons would become much shorter or just non-existent, leading to famine. Animals would struggle to find food and shelter, leading to mass starvation and extinction, and snow would completely cover the land, making travel and survival even more challenging. So it would be pretty grim of a life, for the people managing to survive initially, and with all the radiation, sickness would be almost unavoidable. I already mentioned how strained the healthcare system would be, if it would even continue to exist at all, so good luck getting help if you get injured or sick. But everything could make you sick in a post-nuclear world. The water, the food, the air. If you're exposed to a lot of radiation, you might feel sick, you might throw up, lose your hair, even bleed from the inside. And surviving that doesn't mean you're even out of the woods. You'd likely end up with cancer down the road or some other messed up health problem. Anything that grows in the ground or drinks from the contaminated water sources would be soaking up radiation like a sponge. So canned food would be the safest option, and there wouldn't be an endless amount of that to go around. And the few that would manage to survive all of this and reproduce would probably have offspring with mutations or birth defects. Once again, more on that in a bit. Then we'd have all the violence. Humans have found all kinds of crazy reasons to fight each other throughout history, land, power, honor, pride, but the fight for resources is probably the oldest and most basic in the book. Humans have been battling for food and water since before we were ever fully human. So in a world so short on essentials, it would be survival of the fittest, a real Mad Max situation. Formal government would just crumble, and warlords and tyrants would take their place, gaining power through violence and intimidation. We'd have roaming bands of mutated, angry, animalistic road warriors operating on pure instinct and desperation, taking what they want and need without regard for human life. Am I saying we'd all be reduced to this? No, there could be some people holding out, trying to retain some sense of humanity and community, but we'd always be under threat of violent marauders and scavengers. But it's not just people we'd have to worry about, animals as well. Now, a large percentage of animals would be wiped out along with us, of course. Some would go extinct completely, but that would just leave any remaining predators with even less options for food, making them more desperate and violent than ever. And considering we don't really have tigers, lions, and bears living in cities, there's a good chance a number of these creatures would survive at least the initial blasts, and so many people wiped out, they'd be a lot less nervous about encroaching on our territory, and on top of that, more desperate for food, as I said before. We'd basically be living in the Paleolithic era again, an even more dangerous version of it, and who knows what kind of horrific mutations animals would go through as well. Imagine being chased around by mutant wolves and bears. Could humans rebuild in a situation like this? Could we pull from the knowledge we had before and get all our technology and infrastructure back? Well, it'd be difficult. We certainly wouldn't have the internet anymore, and a large portion of any written material would have been obliterated. Schools, libraries, museums, they'd all be gone. So much of what we knew would be lost forever. We'd basically have to build up from scratch. The only thing we'd really have to count on would be our own memories, passing on what we already know to future generations, and most people really don't know a whole lot. Myself included. I'm not a scientist or an engineer or a doctor. I do this. They'd be in high demand, those people too. Most of them would be scattered or gone, and with them, their expertise. How to grow food, build shelter, or treat illnesses would suddenly become major problems. And it wouldn't just be practical knowledge we'd lose out on, but cultural and historical knowledge as well. Stories, traditions, art, all the things that make us who we are as a people. It'd be kind of nice, though, to go back to a world without the horrors of AI. I mentioned mutations before. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Because in an apocalyptic post-nuclear scenario like this, mutations would become a real concern. I know there's the classic comic book trope of radioactivity leading to crazy mutations, but it really is a thing, just not as cool as it is in comic books. Just look at Chernobyl. There really are mutated animals that roam around the exclusion zone. All the radiation from the bombs would mess with our DNA, and when DNA gets messed up, it can lead to all sorts of changes in living organisms, and not the good kind. Plants growing in contaminated soil might start looking weird, with strange shapes or colors. Animals could develop extra limbs, or just start behaving differently, acting totally erratic and out of the ordinary. One of the biggest dangers, reproductive issues. They could affect animals, making food even more scarce, and we could also start having problems reproducing, inching us even closer to extinction. Somehow, I'm going to try and leave us on a positive note. History has taught us that nature just finds a way. In the end, it always adapts and, finds a way to grow. Now, that doesn't mean our species will be around to see it, but if we do all die out after some horrific nuclear war, the planet will do fine without us. Eventually, anyway. Who knows how long it would take to adapt? Tons of animals will have died off, the land could be scorched and dead, making it almost impossible for plants to grow, but with enough time, changes and adaptations would happen, and vegetation would reclaim the land. The remnants of all our buildings would become part of the natural landscape, our burnt, contaminated ashes would seep into the soil and become part of the earth, new species would grow and evolve, and the circle of life would continue to thrive. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.